And that movie was decadent. It was 2.5 hours long, and I sat there wondering why it was taking so long for the movie to happen, because it seemed like there was a lot. I don't mind long movies, but there's a lot that could have been cut out.
Two and a half
Okay,
hours is a really long movie. That is
what's that?
so. That's a really long movie. Two
Yeah,
and a
I
half.
didn't watch it all in one night
Yeah.
with my schedule, but yeah, I mean, if it were justified, I would have been fine with it. But it was amazing. Just there seemed to be scenes in there that were just kind of totally unnecessary, not really moving the story forward in any interesting way. And
Yeah.
if it, at the very least, some of the storylines can be interesting, because it's certainly not the dialogue that's interesting in these films. So whenever there's a slow moment, you're like wondering, why the director chose that.
Yeah.
The new cut for Justice League is like 4 hours, I think now.
Oh yeah.
The new
Yeah,
Snyder
it was
cut,
four
yeah.
hours.
And so I grew up, there was like the 1970s Superwoman, with Linda Carter, and that was like that was exciting, and there was virtually no special effects in that, and it was just fun. All righty, so some business stuff. Number one, the last day of class is going to be Monday, May 10, and the exam is going to be due on the 13th. And of course, let's be clear that what you'll need to know for the exam and what you'll need to prepare with for the exam, we'll already have covered prior to Monday the 10th, right? So that said, I've also posted the final exam. I haven't finished adding everything to that assignment folder that I will add, but I have the exam itself. I have the rules for writing, which I posted for the midterm. And then I have just a little video going over the instructions, which is the same video for the midterm. So you don't necessarily need to watch it again unless you really feel the need to refresh your memory. So I'm going to put another video up, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, as short as possible, just going over the questions, right? And so the questions, one deals with the Odyssey and one deals with Othello. Same format, exactly the same format, just different questions, right? So let me, now that we're talking about exam stuff, let me mention a couple key things that everyone can focus on going into the final exam. Number one, the issue of staying close to the question. Right? I've asked you specific questions, and everything you say really needs to stay on target with the question and its scope. And the scope maps out like the parameters of the question. So if I ask X, it means that you should include A, B, C, but you should not include D, E, F, right? So the question determines what should be in your answer, but also what should not be in your answer. Some people provided introduction. If you're going to do introduction, I mean, you have to start somewhere. You have to have some kind of opening statement that is broad, and then you get more specific as you go. So, but any type of introduction really has to be focused at the question being asked, and should not be a general statement about the text, right? So I think I said before, there's lots of interesting things you could say about these texts that are true, that are accurate. I don't know, you could say something that's genius, but the point is you need to be responding to the question that's being asked of you. That's crucial. Otherwise, what's said is kind of all for naught. It's like it could be brilliant, but it's not. It doesn't answer the question. And so stay close to the question. Also, stay close to the text. I mean, there's a whole concept of close reading, and really the idea of close reading is just having an appreciation for the specificity of what the text actually says, right? So for example, when you answer a question or someone says, what is that book about? What is that play about? You have to start out by giving a general answer that stays at a certain distance from the details of the text itself. But eventually, as you get into that answer, you really need to get specific to what the text actually says. And it doesn't necessarily mean you need to quote directly from the text verbatim with quotation marks, but it does mean you need to, when you're talking about some element of the text, you need to be tying it down with some specific passage of the text, and not a more when you're explaining your answer, when you're providing support for your answer. So that gets into another big issue of, you know, what I asked was, with your answer, to support with evidence from the text. I think on the whole, everyone could have done a better job citing the text, um, uh, either by paraphrase or verbatim, in which you cite the page and you're specifying a specific bit of text that that you're addressing, either as support for your claim or as part of your claim, whatever it happens to be. But the answers are to be found in the text and reasoning from the text. So staying focused and drawing on the text clearly, and not talking about the text in a kind of very broad, very generic way. You want to be as specific as you can. And I mean, in some sense, you know, I find myself reading, and sometimes I find a student, like, they make a claim about the text that I really don't agree with. On one hand, but on the other hand, I see where that claim is coming from. I see that they're responding to something specific in the text, and I mean, therefore, there's a certain justification for what they're saying, and that even if I personally don't agree with it, because it's an interpretive element, it's not just a factual matter. That, I mean, they're going to get credit for having said something. An interpretation based on a specific element of the text, and not just some kind of broad claim. So I mean, as I've said, your interpretations are yours, so long as you can support with evidence. I'm not concerned whether I necessarily agree with every last element of your interpretation. The key is to try to prove what you're saying based on the text. So if you're gonna make a bold claim, if you're gonna make a claim, you got to support that with evidence, and the evidence ultimately is going to come from the text. Okay. Any general questions about the exam before we start moving in to today's discussion? Okay. All righty. So, you know where a great place to start with any work of literature is, any play, any novel? You start with the title. So, you know, this play is by Shakespeare. We can talk about him a little more going forward, and some of his interests and attitudes, and some of the ways in which his plays represent something about the ethos and spirit of the time of Elizabethan England. This play is written in 1603, the last year of Queen Elizabeth's rule in England. And why is it called Elizabethan England? Because that's the period of Elizabeth's rule. She dies. James the First becomes the king, and he's actually the king that authorizes the translation of what becomes the King James Bible, the one that we read earlier this semester. Let me just say a little bit about the context. I mean, this is a very fascinating period and significant period in world history and also English history, in terms of it's the later stages of the Renaissance and the early stages of what is called the Baroque period, in which there's an intensifying interest in a kind of a realism that you don't see in, certainly not in medieval style writing, and certainly a type of realism that you don't see throughout the early stages of the Renaissance. And I should say that there's something about the interest in a kind of empirical reality that connects in with the emergence of natural science during the Renaissance. The scientific revolution happens in the 17th century. You think of people like Galileo, Rene Descartes, and Francis Bacon, who's sometimes considered to be Shakespeare himself, but that's a great matter of dispute. These are some of the founders of modern natural science. And, you know, the age of the Renaissance, book learning still dominated the collective mindset of much of the world, not just the Western world, but the Islamic world, and the West, such that if you wanted to understand the truth of things, if you wanted to understand the nature of things, you turn to things like either the Bible or, you know, the Renaissance. The Renaissance means rebirth. Rebirth of what? What is the Renaissance the rebirth of?
Is it the rebirth of ideas?
Absolutely. And the rebirth of a whole, a broad set of ideas. Anyone want to help Jessica out, be a little more specific? What kind of ideas? Where did they come from?
Like art.
The French Revolution.
Not quite the French Revolution. So that's the 18th, the end of the 18th century. Here we are at the beginning of the 17th century. All right, so Carlos says it. Very important for one's education. Something that, you know, by the end of your college education, you should have had received a clear understanding from a history class or political science class, so or an art history class for that matter. So the Renaissance, artistic expression, good. Renaissance is just a French word for rebirth, and it's literally the rebirth of ideas, ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of looking at the world that come from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And if we think about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, we're particularly talking about the pagan heritage, the pagan pre-Christian traditions that come starting with Homer and going down to Plato and Aristotle and the Greek dramatists, and then into the Roman philosophers, the Roman moral philosophers, and the Roman dramatists like Virgil and Ovid and the like. So the first thing is that Shakespeare sits at a very interesting moment in the development of this history that comes out of the ancient Near East on one hand, which is to say the biblical tradition, Jerusalem, and on the other hand, the pagan Greek and Roman tradition. And what you'll see in Shakespeare is a mixing and a manipulating of both those traditions. So if you think about it, you know, the ancient Greek and pagan and Roman pagan ways of thinking are being reborn in a Christian society. And of course, it's partly this rebirth that starts to destabilize the nature of Christian society and starts to turn away from simply believing that a book, for example, like the Bible, has all the answers, the totality of the world in it, the way we've kind of come to understand what the Bible means. The Bible means it is the book with all the necessary truths for life, right? And so among the many things that Europeans, Italians, French, English, start taking a particular interest in is like natural philosophy that gives birth to natural science. And that if you want to understand the world, you don't learn about it through books. You learn about it through experience. You learn about it through the information that comes through the senses. And what you see in Shakespeare is a developing of a certain type of naturalism. And I want to be qualified by that, because if you look at his language, Obviously, there's something very theatrical about the language. Obviously, this is not the way ordinary Englishmen and women spoke on the street once they left the theater after watching a play by Shakespeare. So the language still has the affect of the kind of like artistic context. It's not a real world language. On the other hand, he does introduce a lot of phraseology that comes from the street, right? And while Shakespeare's language is still artificial, it doesn't have this high-minded, noble style of writing that was characteristic of the earlier Renaissance, and with a kind of classical style of writing that was even more artificial. I mean, he was criticized for a lot of the kind of bawdy phrases that and lowbrow phrases that find their way into his writings, that while it still has an artificial quality, make references to the way people spoke out in the world. So while the language still has a kind of artificial quality, he seems to be trying to depict the natures of human beings and certain situations with great verisimilitude, with great sense of reality and penetration, particularly in the kind of mysterious nature of the characters. And part of this interest seems to be brought on by the developing concern. If you want to understand where reality is, you don't find it in a book, you find it in the experiences of the world itself. And this is really famously captured in the name of the theater that he was able to build to present his plays, called the Globe Theater, which was really intended as a kind of microcosm of the globe or of the world. And this concern for worldly experience becomes really clear. For example, if we look at the setting of this play of Venice, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So let me just finish the Renaissance, rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman pagan ideas. Now, the key thing about the Renaissance is that it was not confined to art and artistic expression. That's really important, because that's typically where we learn the kind of paradigm of the Renaissance. We think of painting like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and so on and so forth. And that's true, but it also included scientific ideas. It also included political ideas. It also included moral ideas. It really spanned the gamut of all the major kind of intellectual disciplines. It was not confined to the arts. And that's really crucial because, for example, a lot of the ideas portrayed or expressed in Shakespeare's plays deal with political things that actually have to do with ancient political thought and ancient political history. Like, for example, he's got a play on Julius Caesar. And so what's interesting is Shakespeare, in a sense, synthesizes a Christian tradition coming from the Bible, a biblical tradition on the one hand, with this pre-Christian Greek and Roman tradition. And of course, one of the great challenges of the Renaissance was just how thinkers, how writers combine these two, because while some things can be easily harmonized, the Christian and the Greek and Roman, there are some things that clearly can't be harmonized, and there are interesting tensions in there. Okay, so the title, right? When we think of this play, we think of the name Othello, referring to this main character who is a prominent figure in Venice. But the full title is The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice. The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, right? So first off, we have a tragedy. And tragedy is, of course, a classic form of drama. Does anyone know, generally speaking, what's involved in a tragedy, or what it's about, or what it's like? So the Greeks in the 6th century BC, 5th century BC, developed the genre of tragedy. And here Shakespeare is picking up on that history, on that tradition. What's a tragedy? Does anyone know what a tragedy consists of? what it involves?
Definitely
It involves-
sadness.
Okay, so the first thing we think of is sadness, suffering, sorrow. Absolutely, right? So we get the audience gets portrayed some of the hard truths of our existence. I mean, this tragic element can even be seen in the Odyssey, although when Homer writes the Odyssey, the full-blown tradition of tragic drama is not developed yet, is not developed. But we see, for example, the focus on the human condition involving a lot of suffering, involving either the imperfections of human life. We live in a world after the fall. I mean, that's a Christian way of thinking about it, but the tragic vision is really a fallen world of imperfection. Either the world is imperfect or our nature is imperfect, and those imperfections are magnified and highlighted on stage in a way that you cannot miss them, because they sit at the center of the drama. So suffering, sadness, imperfection. What else? Does anyone know any like formal characteristics of a tragedy?
Does it include romance?
It could. It could. Doesn't have to, though, right? I mean, it could be a political drama, which is all about ambition and doesn't necessarily involve love relationships, at least not directly in any significant way. In this case, obviously, the tragedy is bound up with Othello and the relationship with his wife, because his downfall leads to her downfall. Any other thoughts? Tragedy?
Don't most tragedies with Shakespeare end in like one or more characters like dying in the end?
Okay, good. So tragedies always end badly, right? Nobody escapes. Nobody escapes the conflict. Nobody escapes the imperfections. And actually, one way to think about comedies, which is kind of the opposite style of drama. I mean, Shakespeare has a comedy called All's Well That Ends Well. All's Well That Ends Well. And in comedies, however awful certain situations might be for characters, however implausible it could be that they actually solve the problem and live happily ever after. In comedies, they manage to resolve these problems that allow them to live happily ever after, whereas in tragedies, the conflicts always breed the downfall of the central characters, and that there's no way that they're going to escape their fate. This reminder that there are flaws and suffering built into kind of the human experience, that no matter how great the main character is, no matter how exceptional or the virtuosity of their deeds, there is nothing they can do to escape their destiny or escape their fate. So that's good. In tragedies, things do not end well. Any other thoughts about tragedies?
Professor, I have
They're usually unexpected sometimes.
Okay, good. So let me pick up on two things. One thing Carlos said, and then one thing Jessica said of unexpected. So let's get a little definition of formally speaking, a tragedy. A tragedy is almost always the portrait in action of an esteemed member of society who is extraordinary. They are a superior human being. They are not the average person. For example, in Shakespeare's comedies, you see many depictions of ordinary people that are like the audience. They're like us. When we look at a tragic figure, they are superior to us, and we're to appreciate and recognize their superiority to us. And of course, here's the irony. Despite the fact that they're superior, you could even say that they're godlike, they're still just a mortal being, which means they have the same flaws as everyone else. And of course, since they're so exceptional, their flaws, in fact, are even greater, right? That quote's not quite applicable. So one of the messages is for the ordinary people, kind of average audience watching it, that even great people fall, right? And that there is no escaping fate. It's unexpected in the sense that the main character is not aware of the fall. So they have a tragic flaw, and the tragic flaw is going to force them to have a tragic fall. They're going to suffer. They're going to lose what they have. They're going to lose their life, etc. And at least for the main character, that loss is portrayed as unexpected. They're not anticipating what's going to happen to them. I remember I had a high school teacher describe it as, the tragic character is walking down the side of a building, and around the other side is a car coming full speed, but they can't see around the corner, and they don't see the car until they're right there, and then they get hit by the car, and that's the end of it. So it's unexpected for them. But we have actually something we've talked about before with Job, the idea of dramatic irony, and that's simply a concept which happens all the time in plays and creates the tension in them, which is that we know things about the characters. We know things about Iago, for example, that the main character does not know. They're oblivious to, they're ignorant of. Now, they could be ignorant because, number one, there's no possible way they could have known that thing. Or number two, they could be ignorant because they're unwilling to see the truth of things, because they have some type of flaw that an arrogance or an insecurity that prevents them from being willing to look at the truth, right? So I'll give you an example. Oedipus is I think I mentioned him last class. One of the great tragic figures of ancient Greek drama. He kills his father and sleeps with his mother, right? And he unexpectedly discovers that that's what he's actually done. The irony is there's no way that he could have ever known those facts because they were withheld from him, and no amount of looking would have yielded those answers until they actually came out at the end. They came out at the end of the story. And so he's actually not really held responsible for that. Whereas there are other things that he does which are a result of his arrogance or his hubris, his pride, that he's blinded by. So, for example, if we just talked about the suitors are characters who really, they had all the facts at their disposal to see what was going on, aka that Odysseus is in their presence, yet they do not want to believe the truth because they can't muster up the courage to deal with it, and they don't really have the resources to deal with it because they're not hardened men. They've been sitting and drinking for months on end. So, for example, Othello is completely oblivious to Iago's true motives, completely oblivious to Iago's true nature. I mean, we can ask the question, should he have known better about Iago? And of course, there are other questions about how he might have handled the information he thought he was given, and how he handles his wife. And there are things he never does, like he has very little trust in his wife for some reason, despite the fact that she's displayed herself to be this very pristine person throughout the play. With a few exceptions that are not her fault, like Iago contrives these situations that make her look culpable when in fact she's not. And of course, you know how Iago is portrayed throughout the play. Everyone calls Iago good friend Iago. Oh, honest Iago, right? Everyone in the play is deceived by Iago up until the very end. Okay, so tragedy of Othello, right? And so look at the rest of the title here. This is really significant because this will play out in the language and the perspective on this character throughout the play. yes, this play is partly about race, but it's not really just about race. This man isn't just a different color skin. We'll talk about specifically what a Moor is in a second, but he has a different cultural background. And well, despite his own personal history and his own personal lineage and the color of his skin, which is, it's not black, it's a kind of like mulatto, uh, slightly dark, kind of Middle Eastern color of skin, right? Moors come from North Africa, and they're Muslim, as part of the Islamic conquests that occurred in the Middle Ages of North Africa and parts of southern Europe and Italy and Spain, for example. Right. So notice how he's identified. He's identified twice in the title. One time he's identified as Othello. The other time he's identified simply as the Moor of Venice, right? And of course, Venice is an Italian city. It is a European city. So a Moor in Venice, there's just a tension between those two things, right? And of course, all the other characters are white Europeans who are native Venetians and very savvy and familiar with the ways of Venice. And Venice is this whole kind of character that we have to kind of get familiar with in terms of what it's like. One second. It's an eventful day today. So Othello is his first name, right? And you'll see throughout the play that there are times where he's identified specifically as Othello, the specific identity of an individual human being with his own characteristic traits. And sometimes he's just identified as the Moor, right? And what is the Moor? I mean, independent of exactly what a Moor is, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. A Moor ends up being a kind of a stereotype, right? A racial, a cultural, a religious stereotype, because Moor implies a person of a Berber background, which is a certain tribal ethnic identity from North Africa, of a certain light, dark colored skin, who is a Muslim typically, right? Because of the Islamic invasions. So is this character identified in his individual attributes, or is it identified in this generic stereotype? And of course, today with, I don't know, the Derek Chauvin verdict and all the attention given to either racial incidents or incidents that are seen through the racial lens, and these issues, these stereotypes come to the fore when these incidents happen. I mean, we have a very intimate familiarity. And, there is no doubt that part of this play is about the tension between this man in Venetian society. He is an other. He is a stranger. He is a xenos, right? He is an outsider on one hand. He is a kind of alien. We could use that word. In the same way, we see this tension between people who are, native of a certain area in the Odyssey to people who are foreigners, and the tensions that play out in that context. So the full title here is really important. But we should also say this: Venice was one of the most cosmopolitan European cities in the Renaissance, and it was really at the zenith of its economic, its political, and its military power. So it's really important. As a Moor, this whole play, which is set in the Renaissance times, the play is not set deep in the past. It's set mostly contemporaneous to the time that it's written, but I think likely it's set in the 16th century. So Venice was a major trading outpost on the Adriatic Sea. Of course, there's the boot of Italy that comes down to Sicily, and Rome is over on the west side. And as you travel up the east side of the boot, and then you start to go from the vertical to the horizontal to like the main body of Europe, that's where Venice is, on this kind of lagoon. And it's a very unusual city, but it was a great commercial trading power and had a massive fleet, both for commerce, but also for military campaigns. Fleet meaning a large body of ships. And Venice was one of the major trading hubs for between East and West. So Venice, more so than most cities, in Renaissance Europe, was a very open city. It was a very cosmopolitan city. It had people who were exposed to different ways of life. Remember what Odysseus, many men he saw and learned their minds, learned their ways of life, right? So Venice, as a cosmopolitan place, like any urban city that has that kind of exposure, like New York, it was not unusual for them to have this kind of commerce, socially speaking, with people from other cultures, right? I mean, they were trading with the Far East, the Middle East, the Near East, with Africa. So they had kind of seen it all. If any European city was going to get exposed, it was Venice. And they were also one of the most powerful cities at the time. And one thing they did was help to prosecute the war against the Turks. So in 1452, I think it is, 1452, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. And the Turkish Empire is the other dominant force in the world, counterbalancing the Europeans, and they're trying to make incursions into Europe and expand their domain of conquest. And the Ottoman Turkish Empire existed up until World War I. Here we're talking about a play being written in 1603, but the Ottoman Turks existed. Their final kind of being extinguished as a geopolitical force happens in World War I. And so there were, for hundreds of years, there were ongoing tensions between the European West and the Islamic Turks. And so this is, of course, significant because Othello is a character. He's a general. What was Othello's task? What was he tasked to do by the end of book one? First of all, what is Othello? Like, what's his role in Venetian society?
He's a military commander.
Yeah, and I think probably the best word is something like a general, right? He's a commander of troops, and he's like the head commander, and the only person above him are the politicians who give him the directions about when to go to war, right? And so the quote unquote president of Venice is the Doge. So we see very early on that the dispute with Desdemona's father plays out in what's called the Doge's Palace. And this is in the main center area of Venice. It's an actual building. It's kind of like their version of the White House, right? And it's where the Doge is essentially kind of the president of Venice. And the Doge adjudicates the conflict between Othello and Desdemona's father, who's very upset that they've been married in the way that they've been married. And the Doge tasks Othello as a general to do something. What is it?
To go to the island of Cyprus to prevent it from Turks invading.
Yeah, so Cyprus is in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's getting close to like the eastern part of Greece, and I guess it's basically south of Turkey, and it's pretty close to, I guess, like Israel and Jordan, like right in the Near East, the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And so who does he have to fight against?
The Turks.
Yeah, again, yeah, pretty obvious, against the Turks. And so this is fascinating. Here, this man and the Turks, obviously Islamic, and this tension between the Christian world, Christian European world, and the Islamic world is highlighted in this play, right? And this is just a function of the history of the time. There was a famous battle in the 16th century called the Battle of Lepanto that was really spearheaded by Venice as the Venetian Republic in repelling the Turks and preventing their advance toward any greater conquest of European territory. And so there's an interesting tension here. Othello is a kind of hybrid character. He, let me put it this way. He's a Venetian, but he's of Moorish descent. And of course, his Moorish descent can't be erased because he's got the color of his skin, right? I mean, it's interesting. Alexis de Tocqueville said that the big problem of slavery in America is that, and he put it bluntly, he says, you're always going to know who the slaves were because of the color of their skin, precisely because slavery was based on the color of one's skin. And he gave a comparison because, of course, slavery has existed everywhere across the globe. And in many cases, it still exists today. They just don't call it that. And they pretend like it's illegal, but they do it anyway. Or they have other names for it that I won't go into now that sound really good, but in fact, it's just slavery. So for example, in Europe, of course, you had slaves, right? But they were all the same color skin. So 2 generations later, someone who was descended from a slave, you never recognize who they are because they all look the same, right? And nobody superficially can treat that person different because they can't possibly know that 2 generations ago that they were descended from a slave. Othello, I mean, so we'll ask this in just a minute. Othello is a man whose ancestry and cultural background cannot be erased because it's right there on the surface of his skin for the duration. But obviously there's a tension. This guy is also the general in the Venetian military. He is the head commander. He's like, I don't know, the joint head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and given this task. And of course, so this dual identity that Othello has really is a kind of microcosm of this tension between, you could say, East and West, the Islamic world and the Christian world. And that tension seems to actually be playing out at him. And especially when we look at the end of the play and some of the things that Othello says, that will become really, really quite clear. Okay, so we've established, and if you watch the video, you know what a Moor is, right? It's a light, dark-skinned person from North Africa who tribes that were eventually converted by Arab Muslims who conquered the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages, right? Question: is Othello more a Moor, or is he more a Venetian? Does he, we've been talking about how he's an outsider in Venetian society. Does he fit in to Venetian society? How does that identity mesh or not mesh with Venetian society?
I think his identity kind of mashes up with Venetians because he's so well adapted to it, and he's in love with a young Venetian woman.
Okay, I mean, good. So in what ways? So let's be clear. The exact details of Othello's history are not completely displayed in the play. We do learn things, for example, that his mother, eventually he talks about his mother, and he talks about the handkerchief that his mother gave him, which he then gave Desdemona, which will become significant later in the play. His mother seems to be, for lack of a better word, more ethnic. She clearly was not exposed to European culture, and he talks about her, some of her superstitious beliefs, and even a kind of witchcraft that she has that seems clearly derivative of this culture that they're coming from. We don't know his birth, where he was raised, who he was raised by, but he clearly has spent most of his life in European society, right? He is adapted to the life of Venice and its values, its principles, what it respects. I mean, my goodness, folks, he's a general. If they really had a problem with his identity, they would not have allowed him to attain that rank. And it clearly indicates, I think the key word here is that he is assimilated into this society. And the two dead giveaways that he, among others, that he's dead, that he's assimilated, is number one, he's the general of the military, which is this very, it's not just a powerful position, but it's a very prestigious position. And of course, Iago is quite irritated, in part that not only does he not have a more significant position in the military, but that it's a Moor who has the top position, which only indicates that there were open-minded people who gave him this position to begin with, right? And the other thing is assimilated. Obviously, he seduces Desdemona. And of course, there's great controversy over exactly how he seduced her, right? But she falls in love with him. And clearly they're compatible with one another. Any other thoughts about evidence that he's assimilated into this Venetian society?
I mean, the fact that he can marry a white, like an European, like it must mean that they're not so racist and can't allow these things to happen, you know?
Well,
Like,
sure, but I mean, let's not discount Brabantio. That's Desdemona's father,
Yeah.
right? So this is a world, right? We have to remember she's young. She's a teenager. She's a virgin. She's a teenager. She has not been with any other man, and this is a world in which typically the suitor comes to ask the husband for the hand of the daughter, and the father is apprised of what's going on, and the father signs off on it. The father okays it. The fact that they've eloped is very provocative, and it definitely suggests, and also Brabantio's reaction, there are always degrees of racism. I mean, we always paint it, dare I say, we paint racism in black and white. Let's put it this way. What's Brabantio's attitude toward Othello prior to him wanting to marry his daughter? Did anyone pick up the relationship between Brabantio and Othello before they eloped?
I don't know, talk.
Pardon?
Like he wasn't against him before she came into the picture with him.
I would put it even more strongly than that.
They were like really close, like had a bond.
Yeah, so this comes out toward the end of Act 1, in which Othello he's kind of almost put on trial in an informal way in the Doge's palace, such that the Doge kind of plays the role of judge, and Brabantio is the accuser, and he accuses Othello of kind of of seducing his daughter in an untoward way for the wrong reasons, right? Having bad intentions, just trying to take advantage of her. And Othello has to acquit himself. He's the defendant, and he has to demonstrate his innocence. And he gives a long talk, basically, about who he is, his biography, and in particular his relationship with Brabantio and then with Desdemona. And I mean, how does he know Desdemona? He knows Desdemona through his relationship with Brabantio. And what was his relationship with Brabantio prior to wanting to marry his daughter? It was very good. And Brabantio took an interest in this older soldier. He's not young. Desdemona is very young, but Othello is a man like Odysseus, who is a warrior who's got a lot of experience under his belt. And of course, one of the problems of Othello is that his experience is really confined to the field of battle. He knows battle, he knows war. He's depicted as courageous, right? So he has all, and having good judgment in the context of the military. So he has all the, talk about assimilation, he has all the right virtues of this society for the position he holds. And so we're talking about the racism of Brabantio, whether they're racist or not. So Brabantio was very happy to be friends with Othello when it was a kind of a bromance. But then the moment that the general, who is a Moor, takes his daughter's hand, all of a sudden to come back to the title here, he's no longer Othello, and he is now the Moor. And we'll look at it. You'll notice that the language shifts when Brabantio makes these accusations of Othello basically trying to take advantage of Desdemona. When he makes the accusations, he no longer calls him Othello, and he just calls him the Moor, right? Which of course has, in that context, has a derogatory connotation. Other elements that Othello is assimilated, other evidence that Othello is assimilated to this society. What's Othello's religion?
Christian.
Yeah, he's a Christian. So again, we don't know the details of what happened, but when he talks about his mother is clearly not a Christian. She has some kind of tribal animistic religion. I mean, it kind of like it reminds me of like what you'd see in the islands, like kind of Creole, kind of voodoo type of religion. And maybe this is a stereotype that Shakespeare is painting himself, but it's very clear that she's not a Christian, right? So whatever his trajectory in life has been to get to this point, he's spent a substantial amount of time in European society and being assimilated, and he seems completely, immersed in it. Like there's no part of him that doesn't fit. Well, there is some problems. The irony is the problem that he has in his personality has nothing to do with with matters of assimilation, because he's a Venetian, right? Here's the irony. He's not exactly a Moor of Venice. He's a Venetian of Venice, a place that has all kinds of foreigners. This man is not a foreigner. You don't put a foreigner at the head of your military, right? You just don't do that. So he's a Christian, and it's obvious he's devout, right? He's got flaws. There's no doubt about that. We're not saying that he's perfect, but we're just saying that he prays to the Christian God, and he sees himself definitively in Christian terms. I mean, particularly when he talks about fighting the Muslim Turks, right? So an interesting kind of religious drama playing out here. So why don't we just go through and do this? I'll just go down here. Why don't we just go through some of the other characters? Why don't we just talk about Iago? Who's Iago? What's he all about?
He serves under Othello's army.
Okay, he's an ensign in Othello's army. Good. So he's a military man himself. It's a little subtle in the text, but he is he's younger than Othello, but he's not like wet behind the ears either. He's had some experience in battle. I mean, it's interesting whenever Iago is depicted, he's depicted as wickedly intelligent, and he's always kind of, he's never very, I don't want to say he's not masculine looking. He's not very strapping looking. He doesn't look like a soldier in any film that he's ever depicted in. Actually, Kenneth Branagh is pretty buffed in this film compared to other roles that he played.
The
But
one I saw, he looked like he was like a good looking, like, I don't know, like he seemed like a military guy. No, the one that you
yeah. In this film, I realized. So, I mean, if you watch enough Kenneth Branagh, he's normally, and he's the guy who plays Othello, and he's the guy who directed the play and adapted it to the screen. He's actually more buffed in this film than most of his films, so he clearly worked out for it. And in a lot of the films, Iago, he's all mind, right? And he's obviously very intelligent, and they want to highlight his intelligence. They kind of lose sight of the fact that he's depicted as a war, not just an intellectual chess player or warrior, but physical warrior. So what's Iago's deal? He's a military man. What else?
he's married to
Okay,
Amelia.
very good. 28. I'm sorry.
He's married to Amelia, the maid servant of Desdemona.
Okay, good. So he's married to Amelia, who's the servant of Desdemona. So you see how his whole family, his whole household, I mean, he doesn't have children, but husband and wife, they are dependent on, you know, Othello's household, and they are servants. I mean, in the same way as an ensign, he's serving his commander. His wife is also serving Desdemona. So they're both in subordinate positions, right? Which is, they're not in the positions of authority. They're in the position of taking orders rather than making the orders.
Sorry to interrupt, but what's an ensign? Like, I didn't get that. And how do you spell that?
Yeah, so it's a lower rank. I think I've got it right here, right? So ensign. I mean, I just know it as a lower rank in the order of rank of the military. I could look it up and give you.
Okay. No, it's okay.
In the text, they also talk about him being an ancient. I know this is going to get more confusing with more words, and that he I think carries the flag in battle. I mean, this is an age when people went into battle, they carried the flag of their side, and that one of the roles that you had was carrying the flag. So, I mean, for example, if you watch like Civil War films, you'll see that there are standard bearers who are soldiers who are designated to carry a flag rather than shoot a gun, right? Okay, Hamadou says standard bearer. There you go. I mean, I think the key thing is that he is a lower level officer, right? Because Cassio takes this position of the lieutenant, which is his right, like the commander's right hand man, as it's portrayed in the film. So what's Iago's? I mean, that's the least of Iago, to say that he's a soldier of a certain rank. What's Iago all about? What's his deal?
Like, he's really jealous of Cassio for getting the lieutenant position from Othello, and he kind of hates Othello for it.
Okay, good. So initially we get this whole image of jealousy, and particularly jealousy of Cassio, as the initiating motivation for, number one, his hatred, not just of Othello, but also of Cassio. So what happens early on in the play, through Iago's speech, we discover that Cassio has recently been elevated in rank to this position of lieutenant to Othello, which is a kind of a right-hand man, second in command. Cassio is now going to be giving orders to Iago. We've got this clear hierarchy of the military, right? That's rigid. Why is he so jealous? This is important because I think, you know, another man would have seen Cassio gets the position. They would have been, okay, I'm fine with that. That's just the way, that's the way the cookie crumbles. That's the way it goes. Why was Iago so jealous? What does it say about his concerns, his desires in life, that he was so jealous at Cassio?
I think it showed like his true character behind everything. And I'm pretty sure that like in the setting today in like modern life, a lot of people do have that kind of like not vengeance, but like this kind of distaste if they ever like refuse something that they feel like they're entitled to, but they just don't show it because that's kind of like what you have to do. You kind of just can't show it.
Yeah, he has this distaste. I think that's a good word. There is a bitterness, you know, a deep, deep cutting bitterness he has. And so jealousy kind of touches the surface of the general idea, but it really cuts to his core. So you say it really gets to who he is. What specifically is it? Like, what specifically does the jealousy say about him? The deeper thing. So Shoshana says he's arrogant. Why, let's put it this way, why is he so upset that, and this isn't complicated, but we need to all understand this. Why is he so upset with the fact that Cassio has gotten this elevated position? I mean, he spends a lot of time talking about this at the outset of the play.
Doesn't he like feel like self-entitled, like he deserves it more than Cassio?
Okay, good. So to say that he's arrogant, I think more specifically is to say he thinks, I am worthy of this position. I know who I am. He says something, you know, I know my own worth, or I know my own price, right? This has to do with his own estimation of his own worth, right? And this clearly ties in a huge way with the theme of recognition in the other sense of the meaning of the word, meaning social recognition, meaning honor seeking, meaning wanting to be recognized by the world, and by people whose opinions you respect. You want your worth, your status to be recognized, right? So the problem with Iago, I mean, an ensign, as far as I know, is not a very elevated status. And for a man who's so intelligent and clever, and also he apparently has experience, it's rather stunning that he is so low on the totem pole. And he doesn't feel like his merit and and the station that he's actually been given are in alignment. I mean, frankly, what does he think he deserves? What does he think he's entitled to? What kind of position does he deserve from his own point of view?
Like Othello's.
Yeah, I mean, he thinks he's the real master. He thinks he's the real commander of these three. Is there any other reason that he despises Cassio getting the position? What does he think of Cassio? Does he think Cassio was worthy of this position?
Not at all.
Yeah, and absolutely. So not only does he think he is worthy of it, he sees Cassio as distinctly unworthy of it, right? He just does not deserve it. Anyone pick up the reasons why he thinks Cassio is not deserving, or how he thought Cassio got the position?
Does he kind of think he's a little stupid, in a sense?
Yeah, I'm not. Stupid might be a bit of an overstatement, but he definitely thinks that Cassio is a kind of lightweight who's not really serious. Among other things, he accuses Cassio of not really having any real battle experience, right? So this is one reason. You know, his observations about Cassio may actually be fairly accurate. It's when you're seeing through things through the world of Iago through his eyes, you're never quite sure, you know, how real it is what he's saying, because he says a lot of things, and he's willing to, of course, lie a lot. He's willing to lie to the other characters all the time. And then there's an interesting question of, is he willing to lie to the reader as well? Because there are moments where he talks, or the audience, I should say, there's moments where he talks directly to us in what's called an aside. So Cassio's a kind of lightweight. Cassio has never actually fought in battle, or fought very little in battle. He describes him something like as a theoretic soldier. It's like he knows battle in theory, but he's never experienced it in practice. And to not experience it in practice is really not to know it, at all, right? I can read a book on war, but actually experiencing it's a whole other question. He accuses him of being a Florentine, the Florentines were famous bankers and money lenders, and involved in commerce. And I think it's spelled out, I think, in the notes, the footnotes. But when he calls him a Florentine, I think what he's insinuating is that he's purchased his position, right? So, in government, there are ways of getting jobs by purchasing them, essentially. Especially when people like run for president, you'll have other people donate to them. And then when that person becomes the president, the people they donate, who donated lots of money or donated the most money, all of a sudden they become like the diplomatic envoy to, Switzerland or something like that. And they get like a cushy position because of what they've donated. So he accuses him of basically of having purchased his post. So all this speaks to the fact that he doesn't believe that Cassio has true merit in having this position. So we're getting close on time here, but I want to talk about a few of the other characters. Hey, Missy, I'm in the middle of class. Okay, can you come back in a few minutes? No. So what is this jealousy? No. What is the jealousy set in motion with Iago? What happens? Is that a mustache?
Yes.
Wow, you grew it longer than mine. How do you do that?
Paper.
You look like the Lorax.
Yeah, I am a Lorax. How did you guess
it? It was a good, well, I know the book.
Here's a piece of tape.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm not done. So what does Iago end up doing here? She speaks for the trees. Yeah, exactly. Comic relief. What does Iago end up doing with this jealousy?
He ends up like manipulating everyone involved pretty much in the whole story, to kind of bring down a downfall for Cassio and Othello as well. And he manipulates Rodrigo to help him in that. He
okay, good. So there's really two big elements. So Iago cultivates a plot, and at the outset of the play, he already knows what that plot is, and he refers to it in various ways. He talks about this monstrous birth that will reveal itself in time. And the birth is an idea in his head that's going to be given existence by executing the plot. And it will go from something that's just an idea to something that's a reality, right? And there are really two key elements to this plot. Number one is the goal of the plot. And number two is how he does it. So actually, if we start with the second one, manipulation, right? He manipulates every character he comes in contact with, right? And he seems to know exactly how to push their buttons psychologically to get them to do what he wants them to do. And of course, underlying all that is this fundamental deception that every character comes to him and they're in need. They have some kind of need, and a friend in need is a friend indeed. So what does Iago do? He comes to his friends in their time of need and puts his arm around them and says, "Oh, I'll help you out, Desdemona. Oh, I'll help you out, Cassio. Oh, Rodrigo, you pay me a few more gold coins. I'll help you out in getting Desdemona." And they all think that he's their friend, right? And they call him Honest Iago and Good Friend Iago, and that echoes, those words echo throughout the entire play until the end when they realize he's not their friend. So there's the way he does it, and the way he does it is just as significant to what he's trying to do. And yes, he's very clever, very clever. So obviously he wants to bring about the downfall of Othello, but who else does he bring about their downfall? Who are the other characters who he brings about their downfall?
His own wife, Amelia, is one.
Yes, although his plan was not to bring about her downfall, although she was like collateral damage of the people. Yeah, so Shoshana says Desdemona, Rodrigo, Cassio, and Othello. Let's be clear. He's determined to bring about the downfall of all of those characters. Rodrigo simply because he takes advantage of him, and Rodrigo is expendable. Cassio because he's jealous of him and doesn't think he's worthy of the position, and Othello because he didn't get the position he wanted. Any other thoughts about why he despises Othello so much? We'll just go about two more seconds here, and we'll
Because he didn't give him like the position,
like a promotion.
Yeah, can anyone think of any other reasons beside that? Because I mean, there's a particularly intense hatred here that compels him to, murder this man, and also this kind of torturous process of manipulating him that's quite involved and sophisticated. I mean, he invests a lot of energy in this plot and a lot of thought in this plot. And I guess what I'm asking, why does he hate this man so much? Okay, good. So Dev says there are rumors Othello slept with his wife, and we'll have to look at exactly what Iago says. So he claims that, there are rumors abroad that Othello has slept with my wife, and that gives him justification. And Shoshana says he thinks he shouldn't have to answer to him. Yeah, he thinks he's superior not only to Cassio, but he also thinks himself as superior to Othello, and that he should be the true commander, right? And this opening speech that we'll look at next class really makes that clear, what he thinks of him, what he thinks of himself relative to the other characters. If we could, just for 2 seconds, just say a couple words, Desdemona and Cassio, just 2 minutes. Who is Desdemona?
We didn't answer why he wants Desdemona, like why he has her also in mind to get rid of. Like why, why does he hate her also?
Well, maybe we can answer. I agree. We definitely haven't answered that question. Maybe if we answer who she is a little bit, we'll start to get an insight. Let's put it this way. I don't think Desdemona's really done anything so awful to Iago. Obviously she hasn't. They didn't really have much of a relationship until he starts to manipulate her. Who is Desdemona and what's she like?
She's like super innocent, daughter of
The governor.
Close. So she's very innocent. She's very young. So obviously she's partly innocent because she's young, but she's also painted as a character, you can imagine, even if she were an older adult, that she would still have a certain naivete that, for example, Emilia doesn't have. Emilia is anything but innocent. And so she's innocent, she's fair-skinned, she's fair-haired, she's kind of the visual antithesis of Othello as a dark-skinned older man. That's an important feature because those visual elements come up rhetorically over and over again. She is the daughter of a Venetian senator, so that's important. Brabantio is a Venetian senator, and basically the Venetian Republic and was run by this elite group of uh, figures called senators, not unlike what we have today, who are effectively the rulers of Venice. And the Doge is kind of first among equals. He really didn't have that much more power than the rest of the senators. So he's a very powerful and important man, Brabantio. Um, anything else about Desdemona?
She's like a super loyal wife to Othello.
Okay. I mean, she has a very, you could even say simplistic, because there's a kind of negative element to it too, at least when you live in the real world. But I mean, she just has an unabiding, a completely abiding devotion to her husband. She loves him. And of course, this is part of the irony of the way Iago is going to manipulate them, and is the fact that she is a completely committed wife who has no clue the machinations that are going on here. And she, of course, in many ways is the greatest victim of the play, much more than Othello, because we'll have to look eventually at Othello's culpability for what he does with his wife. I mean, yes, Iago deceives him, but there's definitely some important culpability for Othello as well. My theory about why Iago is willing to sacrifice Desdemona is that, I mean, it is precisely because she is so naive. Um, being innocent can be, or being naive can be seen as innocent and pure, but being naive can also seem as a state of ignorance and even foolishness, that you should know better because this is the real world and we're in a rough and tumble world, and you have to be savvy, and you have to you can't assume the best of people the way Desdemona does. She's a fool to be taken advantage of because she doesn't know any better, and she's in a grown-up world. She's not in a world of fairy tales, right? And she doesn't have a keen sense of the reality of the world, which depending who you are, can be seen as positive or negative. Very quickly, Cassio. What's Cassio like? And what does he care about? What does he do? Anyone? 20 seconds. Cassio. Can somebody tell me one thing about Cassio? And we're done. Okay, good. So is Cassio a good man? Cassio is basically, this is important, and this may explain why he was chosen by Othello. Cassio is a decent man. He's a loyal man. He might be superficial in certain ways. He might lack the experience of the other characters or the intelligence or the cunning of the other characters, but he is presented as a decent and wholesome man. He's had a relationship with Desdemona as a friend, and it turns out that he facilitated the relationship between Desdemona and Othello without taking advantage of Desdemona. In fact, this may be one of the main reasons he got his position, that he was a kind of go-between between Othello and Desdemona when they were carrying out their relationship in a clandestine fashion, and he didn't take advantage of the situation. And of course, he gives this famous speech when he's drunk, and he gets his rank removed from him after Iago contrives the situation, where the primary thing he cares about is his rank and his reputation, which is to say, he too cares about recognition and status and honor. And for him, it's the most important thing that he has. And he says, without it, essentially, I'm nothing. I'm nobody, right? Okay. So next class, we'll pick up looking at the situation as the play opens up. And then it'll be based on the homework. We'll look at a couple passages of Iago's speeches that really explain what he's up to. And then also the speech that Othello gives in the Doge's palace as a kind of defense speech where he's trying to acquit himself of the charges of taking advantage of Desdemona. Okay, so with that, I will see everybody on Monday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Professor. Have a
Thank you,
good one.
Professor. Have a nice day.
Mm.
Thank you, Professor. Have a great day.